In the heart of a bustling city, far from the villages where old tales are told, there once lived five brothers. They were inseparable, their bond stronger than blood itself. But what most people didn't know was that this bond wasn't forged in innocence. It was built on a dark pact made during their year at university, where they had gotten caught up in a secret, dangerous cult, a cult whose rituals would shape their lives forever. The ritual was simple but wicked. Whenever one of them had a girlfriend, the others were allowed to take turns with her. It was a twisted game of power and control, a secret that bound them together, and yet it tore at their humanity. They justified it, told themselves it was part of their initiation, a way to show loyalty. But deep down, they knew what they were doing was wrong, and that feeling of guilt, it would come back to haunt them. It started in university, where the five brothers were just like any other students, trying to fit in, make friends, and figure out life. They were close, always hanging out together, but they didn't know what was coming. One night, they were introduced to a secret cult group in campus, but they didn't know that at first. The group promised power, respect, and a brotherhood like no other. It wasn't just about grades or connections, it was about control, and they would be different from everyone else. They would be untouchable. The brothers were skeptical at first, but curiosity won them over. What harm could there be in joining? They asked. They were told they would have the freedom to do whatever they wanted with no consequences. But Kofi, the youngest of the brothers, wasn't convinced. He saw the cracks in the group's promises. He didn't care for the twisted rituals or the idea of manipulating people. He was more interested in his studies and building a life that didn't depend on dark secrets. When the brothers talked about it, Kofi refused to join. He wasn't like them, but they didn't let him off easily. They pressured him. They reminded him of the bond they had as brothers, of how much stronger they would be if they all stuck together. They made him believe that without the group, he would always be left behind. Kofi didn't want to lose his brothers, so after weeks of pressure, he finally agreed to join and took part in the craziest of rituals he didn't believe existed. By the time their final year came around, the brothers had already been in the cult for years. What started as an innocent curiosity quickly earned and turned into something far more dangerous, but they didn't expect everything to come crashing down so fast. The school was in chaos. The cult had gotten too bold, and their twisted activities couldn't stay hidden any longer. One of their cult members, a senior, brutally attacked a girl, one of their own girlfriend, and left her for dead. The girl was found barely alive, her body a wreck. Her parents were powerful, well-connected, and wealthy. They had no tolerance for this kind of thing. They called in favors, and the investigation was quick and ruthless. As soon as word got out about the assault, things fell apart. Many of the cult members were arrested, their names dragged through the mud. The campus was crawling with police. The brothers knew it was only a matter of time before they were caught up in it too. They hadn't been directly involved in the attack, they had been part of the group, and that made them guilty by association. Some of the cult members were snatched from their dorms in the middle of the night. Fear spread like wildfire. Kofi and his brothers kept their heads down. They stayed out of sight, avoided the police, and tried to keep their names off the radar. They couldn't risk getting caught. They were lucky, at least for now. They laid low, hoping the storm would pass and they could finish their last semester and graduate. They didn't know how long they could keep this up, but they had no choice. Their lives depended on it. While the school was on high alert, with whispers about who else might be part of the cult, Kofi felt the pressure building. He had wanted nothing to do with the darkness of the group, but now he was stuck. His brothers were with him, but that didn't make it any easier. Every time they looked over their shoulders, they were reminded of the hell they had gotten themselves into. Then graduation day came. It was a light at the end of the tunnel, the escape they had all been waiting for. But for Kofi, it felt hollow. He had managed to survive, but the weight of the past still clung to him. He couldn't shake the feeling that his connection to the group, his brother's involvement, would follow him forever. After graduation, Kofi and his brothers decided to stay in the same town. The dust had settled from the cult scandal, but the fear of being found out still lingered in the air. They couldn't leave. They had no money, no connections outside of the city. They were forced to stay under the radar, working odd jobs and doing whatever it took to survive. Kofi, however, was different. He had managed to land a decent job at a firm. It wasn't the dream job he had once imagined, but it was enough to keep him afloat. The job gave him some normalcy, some escape from the darkness of the past. He threw himself into his work, hoping to build a future away from the mistakes he had made. That was when he met Amma. She was nothing like the women from his past, nothing like the girls the court had used and discarded. Amma was intelligent, kind, and had a presence that made everything around her seem brighter. She was confident but not arrogant, a rare mix in the world they lived in. Kofi couldn't help but be drawn to her. From the first time they spoke, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: peace. The word felt right when he was with her. He would catch himself daydreaming about her, replaying their conversations over and over in his mind. She saw something in him too, a gentleness he had almost forgotten he had. He started looking forward to every day at work, not just for the job, but because he knew he would see Amma. But it wasn't just his growing feelings for her that complicated things. It was the past, the cult, the betrayal, the darkness. Kofi had buried it deep, but now, with Amma in his life, the fear of it all coming crashing back was impossible to ignore. How could he let her into this world when he knew the truth of who he was? He wasn't just any man. He was a man with a past that could destroy everything he had worked for. Still, the more he saw her, the harder it became to stay away. He couldn't stop thinking about a future with Amma. It felt like everything he had gone through, every mistake he had made, was leading to this moment. Could he really have a fresh start? Could he leave his past behind and have a life with her? Kofi knew the answer wasn't simple. There was so much about him that he hadn't told her, and he wasn't sure if he ever could. His brothers, they were parts of the past he was trying to escape, but they still remained close. Too close. They were living in the same town, working whatever they could to get by. They knew about Kofi's growing feelings for Amma, but they didn't understand the weight of it. To them, she was just another girl. But to Kofi, she was a chance at redemption, a shot at happiness. But how could he hold on to that dream when the chains of his past were still wrapped around him? 2 years passed and life had changed for Kofi in ways he never expected. He had worked hard at the firm, proving himself to be reliable, intelligent, and ambitious. His efforts paid off when he was promoted to a senior position, something he never imagined possible when he first joined. With a stable income and a growing reputation, Kofi finally felt like he was building the kind of life he had once dreamed of. But none of it compared to the real victory, Amma. Their relationship had grown stronger with time. She had been his anchor, the one person who made him feel like he was more than his past. She knew bits and pieces of his struggles, but not everything. He never told her about the cult, the things he had done, the things he had seen. He couldn't bring himself to do it. It was a part of his life he wanted to bury forever. Despite his fears, one thing was clear: he wanted to spend the rest of his life with her. The day he proposed was the happiest day of his life. Amma said yes without hesitation, her face glowing with excitement. They were engaged, and suddenly, Kofi felt like he had finally escaped the ghost of his past. They started planning their wedding, choosing venues, picking dates, and dreaming about a future together. But while Kofi was busy planning a new life, his brothers were watching. They had remained in the same town, struggling in different ways. Some had found small jobs, while others drifted between businesses that never really took off. They still had each other, still lived by the same twisted bond they had formed back in university, and they hadn't changed. At first, they didn't think much of Kofi's engagement, but as time passed, they started to talk among themselves. The youngest of them, the one who had always been different, was about to get married, about to build a new life without them, and it didn't sit well with them. Kofi was too blinded by love to see the shift in his brothers. He thought they had all grown past their university days, that they had moved on just like he had, but he was wrong. The past was never gone. It had only been waiting. As the wedding day grew closer, his brothers started planning too, but their plans had nothing to do with celebration. They were about to remind Kofi that no matter how much he tried to change, no matter how much he thought he could escape, he was still one of them. And on his wedding night, they would make sure he never forget. The wedding day arrived, and it was everything Kofi and Amma had dreamed of. Friends, family, and colleagues gathered to celebrate their love. The ceremony was beautiful, filled with laughter, music, and joy. Kofi felt like he had finally broken free from his past. He had Amma by his side, and together they were stepping into a new life. His brothers were there too, playing their roles perfectly. They smiled, danced, and toasted to his happiness, acting as though they were truly celebrating him. Kofi didn't suspect a thing. To him, they were just his brothers. And despite everything they had been through, he still believed in their bond. As the night went on and the wedding reception started winding down, it was time for Kofi and Amma to leave. The guests were already saying their goodbyes, and Amma was eager to get to the hotel where she and Kofi would spend their first night as husband and wife. Just as Kofi was about to leave, his brothers pulled him aside. Come on, just one last drink before you go. Kofi hesitated for a moment. He could see Amma across the hall waiting for him, but he also didn't want to seem like he was abandoning his brothers, not on a night like this. He had spent years trying to distance himself from their ways, but deep down he still wanted to believe they had changed. All right, just one drink, Kofi finally agreed. They led him downstairs to a private area of the venue, away from the guests. A bottle was already waiting on the table, glasses filled before Kofi could even sit down. The laughter, the jokes, it all felt normal for a moment. Kofi let his guard down, thinking it was just his brothers being his brothers. But something was different. The drinks kept coming, and Kofi was too distracted to notice how quickly they were refilling his glass. He didn't see the looks his brothers exchanged or how they made sure he drank more than them. By the time he realized he had too much, it was already too late. His head was spinning, his body heavy, and his vision blurred as the room started to shift around him. Meanwhile, upstairs, Amma was waiting. She had changed into a more comfortable dress, expecting Kofi to come up any minute so they could leave for the hotel. Kofi was barely conscious as his brothers dragged him upstairs. His body was heavy and his mind was clouded by the alcohol they had fed him. He mumbled something incoherent, but his brothers only laughed, carrying him up the stairs like it was all part of a game. Amma was pacing the room when they walked in. Her face lit up with relief for a second, but as soon as she saw Kofi's state, her expression changed. You got drunk? On our wedding night? She asked, disappointment clear in her voice. The brothers chuckled as they laid Kofi down on the bed. Don't worry, one of them said. It's his big night. He just had a little too much fun. Amma sighed, kneeling beside Kofi. She gently shook him, trying to wake him up, but he was completely out. She could smell the alcohol on his breath. She turned back to the brothers, frustration clear in her eyes. This isn't funny, she said. You should have stopped him. He shouldn't be like this right now. One of them smirked. Relax, Amma. We are just here to help. Before she could process his words, she felt hands grab her from behind. Her breath hitched as two of the brothers held her arms tightly. Panic surged through her. What are you doing? Let me go, she screamed, struggling against their grip. Her heart pounded as realization set in. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't some drunken mistake. The room suddenly felt smaller, suffocating. Kofi lay lifeless just inches away, completely unaware of what was happening. Amma thrashed, trying to break free, but the brothers were stronger. Her voice rose in desperation, but the walls of the room swallowed her cries. The brothers didn't hesitate. They took turns on her, one after the other. Hours later, Kofi's head dropped as he slowly regained consciousness. His mouth was dry and his body was weak, his mind foggy from the alcohol. He blinked a few times, trying to adjust to the dim light in the room. Something felt off. The air was thick and heavy, with an eerie silence that sent a chill through his spine. Then he saw her. Amma lay motionless on the floor, her dress torn and her body limp. Bruises marked her arms and legs, and her face was swollen. For a moment, Kofi's breath was caught in his throat. His mind refused to process what he was seeing. He staggered forward, dropping to his knees beside her. Amma, his voice cracked. He gently shook her, hoping and praying that she would open her eyes, but she didn't move. Panic surged through Kofi. He scooped her up in his arms, ignoring the sharp pain in his head, and rushed out of the room. The staff at the event turned their heads as he sprinted through the hallway shouting for help. Within minutes, they were at the hospital. Nurses and doctors rushed to take Amma from him, laying her on a stretcher and wheeling her away. Kofi stood there, frozen, his hands trembling as he watched her disappear behind the emergency doors. The minutes stretched into hours. He paced the waiting room, running his hands through his hair, replaying everything in his mind. What happened? How had he left himself get that drunk? And where were his brothers? And why did Amma look like that? He kept asking himself these questions. Then the doctor walked in, with his face grim. Kofi Mensah, he called. Kofi rushed forward. How is she? Is she awake? The doctor hesitated before speaking. Your wife was brutally assaulted, Mr. Kofi. She suffered significant injuries. We've stabilized her, but she's still in shock. This was not just a simple attack. Kofi's knees buckled. His breath caught in his throat as the words hit him like a hammer. Brutally assaulted. The room started spinning. His heart pounded in his ears. His hands shook uncontrollably. No, he muttered. No, 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 no. The reality of it came crashing down all at once. He clenched his chest as a sharp pain tore through him. Then, for the first time in years, Kofi broke down. He sobbed like a child, his cries echoing through the hospital halls. His knees hit the cold tile floor, but he didn't care. He wept uncontrollably, gasping for air, his entire world collapsing around him. This was his fault. This was because of his past. This was because of them, his brothers, the people he trusted, the men he grew up with. They had done this. They had destroyed his life, his marriage, his love, and now nothing would ever be the same. Kofi sat in the hospital waiting room, his head buried in his hands, his body trembled and his eyes swollen from crying. Amma was still unconscious, her body fighting for survival. The doctors had done their best, but they didn't know when she would wake up or if she would wake up. The weight of it all crushed him. His past, his mistakes, his blind trust in his brothers, it had all led to this. He couldn't live with it. Kofi stood up, his mind made up. He wiped his face, took a deep breath, and walked out of the hospital. He didn't know if he would ever see Amma awake again, but he knew one thing. His brothers weren't going to get away with this. Not this time. He hailed a taxi and gave the driver the destination, the police station. The moment he stepped inside, officers turned to look at him. He was still in his wedding suit, now wrinkled and stained. His face was pale, eyes hollow. He walked straight to the front desk and looked the officer in the eye. I need to make a confession, Kofi said, his voice steady, despite the storm inside him. The officer raised an eyebrow. About what? Kofi exhaled sharply. Everything. For the next 2 hours, he spilled the truth. He told them about the cult from their university days, about the rituals, about how they had taken advantage of women in the past. He gave them names, dates, and locations. And then, with a heavy heart, he told them about what had happened to Amma. The room went silent. The officers exchanged glances before the lead detective nodded. You're telling us your own brothers did this to your wife? Kofi clenched his fist. With his voice shook. There was no hesitation. Yes, and they need to pay for it. He gave them their addresses, their places of work, everywhere they could be found. Within the hour, the police mobilized. One by one, his brothers were arrested. Some were taken from their homes, others from the bars where they drank like nothing had happened. None of them saw it coming. They resisted, shouted, cursed Kofi's name when they realized who had turned them in, but it didn't matter anymore. It was over. Back at the police station, Kofi sat in the interrogation room, his hands cuffed to the table. He knew he wasn't innocent. He had been part of that cult as well, part of the darkness. A few hours later, an officer walked in. Kofi Mensah, you are under arrest for your involvement in past crimes related to the university court case. You have the right to remain silent. Kofi barely heard the rest. He just nodded. He didn't fight it. As they led him to the holding cell, he had only one thought in his mind. Amma. Would she wake up? Would she survive this? He didn't know. But as the cell door slammed shut behind him, he prayed that No matter what happened to him, she would make it. She deserved to live and she deserved peace, even if he never got to see her again. Moral of the story: the past never truly stays buried. The choices we make, no matter how long ago, will always catch up with us. Betrayal, greed, and evil may thrive for a time, but justice always finds its way. True redemption comes not from hiding the truth, but from facing it no matter the cost. This story serves as a lesson that no crime goes unpunished, and the bonds of brotherhood should never be built on wickedness. If you enjoyed the story and want more gripping African folktales, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support keeps these stories alive. See you in the next one.